welcome everyone. The event we're putting on right now is going to be focused on, as you know, the effects of war, the effects on children of targets of war. We have, which I'll let Alp introduce, I think, myself and Roger McGinty and Federico Bernal, who are going to speak around, we're all going to speak around different aspects of this issue. And it's a difficult thing to think about, and it is certainly a difficult thing to talk about. So know that if you need to step away, and we're not going to do anything drastic, but it's painful. It breaks the heart. So I will just introduce the Dialogue and Difference Project, of which I direct that. I've been director for, I don't know, 12 years, something like that. And what we do is we present events such as this, either in person or virtually, as we're doing now, to talk about difficult topics and difficult subjects, and to listen, to understand. It's not, the idea is not to argue back and forth. We can do that at any time. But the idea is to, how do we begin to think through others' impressions of the dynamics that are going on in Gaza and that area, and also to work together to perhaps develop some shared understandings of what that might mean, how we can think about it, how we can assist if possible, and how we might work with our students if we're teaching, or our research folks if we're doing the research, and how do we make those spaces available without prejudice in regard to what we're facing and what we're not facing it, the folks in Gaza and the Middle East are facing. So that is the overarching goal of the Dialogue and Difference Project. We've done, there's probably topics we haven't taken on head on, but they would be few and far between. So the idea is just, we're going to listen to our three presentations. Dean Alp will present him, we'll talk more about the school and what we're doing. And then we will have the three presentations, and then we will have some discussion. Alp?
Thank you, Patricia, and good morning, everyone. I'm Alp Özerd. I'm Dean of the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And let me start by welcoming you all to this important event. As we know, it's really civilians pay the heaviest toll with their lives, with their suffering, and with their trauma in conflict. But interestingly enough, they don't get much attention. And we talk about belligerence, we talk about war, we talk about the machinery of killing, but not about people who suffered most in such circumstances. And I think what we've been seeing, the horrific events in the Middle East and the humanitarian tragedy that taken place in Gaza, the heavy civilian toll in that context is absolutely terrible. And as the Carter School, we want to closely engage with our Mason community on contemporary peace and conflict resolution matters, and we are holding several events for our Mason community to gain a deeper understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict and really create platforms for constructive engagement and dialogue and to start with, really being able to listen to each other and also share ideas and views, and especially on a matter like women and children as targets of war. I think this urges us to come to a platform that we really need to have this discussion, and it's really heart-rendering what we see day after day, and the killing of civilians and their suffering. So to do this, I'm really grateful for the leadership of Professor Patricia Maulden and her Dialogue and Difference program here at the Carter School for being able to provide this platform for us. As Professor Maulden mentioned, the Dialogue and Difference program is really unique with this methodology, because when it comes to difficult questions and issues like this, the usual setup tends to be just the binary position, or the kind of simplification of really complex issues, and good and evil versus evil, and not really going deep enough on this difficult questions. So I really do think that this is going to be a wonderful event, wonderful opportunity to talk about this difficult issues in a constructive way, and I really want to underline that. And to do this, I'm grateful that two amazing individuals join us as our speakers. So Professor Roger McGinty from Durham University in the UK is a world-renowned expert on peace and conflict resolution, and he's done amazing work in this space. He's one of the prominent leaders of the peace and conflict studies, and he's also a good friend. So I know that he's very passionate about the issues of civilians in conflict, particularly children and young people, and the way the war changes their lives and its impact. So Roger, welcome. It's really great to have you here. Much appreciated. I know how busy you are, but it's fantastic that you'll be part of this event. And our second guest is Federico Borello. He is the former executive director of Center for Civilians in Conflict. Federico had an amazing career in this particular area, done great job with the Center for Civilians in Conflict. So topic like this, talking about women and children in conflict, I couldn't think of anybody more suitable, better position to tell us about this phenomenon and the way wars change so many lives and around the world, but particularly what's happening in Palestine and Israel and in Gaza at the moment. So with that note, I'd like to welcome our speakers, thank Patricia for leading this session, and also just a quick reminder that there will be another Carter School event coming up on December the 7th, during which we'll be focusing on the Gaza narrative between clinical analysis and moral judgment. And that will be in-person event led by one of our professors here, Solon Simmons. Please do come to that event too, and check our website for further details. But without further ado, thank you everybody for joining us this morning, and thanks very much to our speakers and Patricia Maulden for leading this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. I'll start off by focusing primarily on women in the effects on women. And so women and children have long been legitimate targets and have been killed with impunity. That's in wars across time. In other words, they're seen as legitimate targets, not only from the point of view of destroying the group under assault, but also by assuring that the population of that group will be decimated. Women bear children, children come from women, you kill the women, you kill the children, the future children. And also by assuring, so a recent Security Council discussion declared Gaza to be the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. Women and children have made up around 67% of the more than 1,400 people killed to date. That was yesterday or a couple days ago. So in other words, 2 mothers are killed every hour and 7 women every 2 hours. So brief is that the Security Council spoke of the disastrous situation for women and for children in the Gaza Strip due to the Israel-Hamas war, highlighting the acute stresses and needs of mothers and declaring Gaza to be the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. Every day, 180 women give birth without water, painkillers, anesthesia for cesarean sections, electricity, incubators for the babies, or medical supplies. So it is a dangerous thing to be a woman bearing children in that place as right now. So how is this killing and how are these actions justified? There's been a lot of scholarship around the importance in these processes of dehumanization. That to dehumanize a person or to have them be less than human, they're somewhat human, but not quite. Those distinctions are made through social means. And as those individuals become commodified in certain ways, they're bought and sold. They are attached to certain activities and not allowed to go to other activities. Their spaces in which they can operate are very limited. They are surveilled on a constant level. And that is what has been happening in that area for quite some time. So when a person is objectified, they're depersonalized and their individuality is removed. Their integrity is under question, and they are not able to live a life that allows them to thrive or to even exist over time. So the point then is, and this is something Edward Said quoted a long time ago, do we exist? And he's speaking from the Palestinian perspective. Do we exist? What proof do we have? The further we get from the Palestine of our youth, of our past, the more precarious our status, the more disrespected our being, the more intermittent our presence. So loss of social identity, or the adaptation of a different social identity, is a loss of social connectedness. And loss is associated with the disintegration of the body politic, but often of the body personal. Patterson, who did some significant work on incarceration and death, social death regarding slavery, contends that the act of natal alienation or the estrangement or disconnection between historical memory that occurs by severing an individual from their kinship traditions and their heritage, their cultural heritage, their language, their religion, their economic importance, their access to opportunities brings about a social death, not a person. They're still alive, but they're socially dead. And if that happens, the entire community can fall to pieces. So another look at social death is through the racial lens. I look at in terms of prisons in the United States, prisons really anywhere, the idea of having access to benefits as an incarcerated person is almost non-existent. They are as if they are unseen by the society, by the government, by anything. They are in a limbo that they cannot get out of. And so the eligibility of personhood is a form of social death if a person is not seen as a person or a person of value, or is not seen as almost in animal terms. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. It's a living death. And I would say we could perhaps, probably, definitely, in some cases in Palestine, or a lot of cases, there is a living death. And that goes for children, that goes for women, that goes for men, that goes for grandmas, everybody. Okay. So the idea of social suffering is it brings in the economic, the political, the institutional, and so on. And what, is healthcare available? Is food and water available? How many miles do you have to walk as a woman to get firewood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So assuming, now, the effects on, I'll pivot a bit to the effects on women particularly. So women, and I've done work in post-war Sierra Leone, Burundi, and Liberia, and I've seen what I've seen and heard what I've heard, and it's not a lot. There are patterns in it. So the women generally assume all roles in the household. That means they make sure that there's food, if there's food, if there's firewood, whatever they can do, they do to, within the Palestinian context, to make do with whatever is available. And often those things aren't available. Is clean water available? No? Okay. What kind of water is going to be available? Well, it's how do you organize that? How do you, thinking as a woman and a mother, the burden of that responsibility is strong. And the burden of the inability to actually see to it that your household is thriving must be a torture every single day. So if women have unequal status in society, which often mostly they do, if there is poverty, social family separation and disintegration because of what's going on within a larger society, women are victimized, they're murdered, they're tortured, they're brought into sexual slavery, they're raped, they've experienced sexual abuse, and yet they continue to do the best they can for their families and communities. So to destroy a culture, women are tactical targets of significance. It's not accidental, it's purposeful. And so if the woman and the family survive, after whatever happens, the effects of those dynamics do not go away. Those things are carried in hearts and minds. They're carried in the body in different ways that the body is affected. They impact not only the present, but the future. And that is, the long-term effects are just, can be astonishingly horrible. So, the responsibilities are on women's shoulders for the most part. I want to just do a mention of what social suffering was. Social suffering, it results from political, institutional power and what that does to people, and reciprocally, how these forms of power themselves influence responses to social problems, for instance, health, welfare, legal aspects, moral aspects. So if I'm a woman in a particular place at a particular time with a family, and I am responsible for the family, for the women's section of the work, and I cannot accommodate that. There's no way I can do that. There's suffering on the woman's part, there's suffering on the children's part, and there's suffering on the society's part. It's problematic, mildly. One thing I want to speak to, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues, is the death of a child. Women have seen their children killed. They've come home and their children are dead or gone. They have other family members to take care of. They have other responsibilities within the existence of they've lost a child, which, having lost a child, I can tell you, it is unbearable. It is unbearable. And those women continue in their work despite that, because they have to. They have they have parents, they have siblings, they have children, grandchildren. It is unbearable. And I can only admire them beyond words for what they do every day under the circumstances in which they live and the opportunities that they have. They are heroes, every one of them. And I'll just leave that there. So, Roger or Federico?
Shall I go, Roger? Yes, thank you, Patricia. It will be difficult to come after this. Thanks, everyone. As Patricia said, my name is Federico Borello. For the past 10 years, I've run Center for Civilians in Conflict. I've left only a couple of months ago, just before this crisis. So first, let me say that this, as Patricia was saying, is a topic, a region, an area that provokes a lot of strong emotions. I will try to be respectful of the tragedy that is unfolding and of people's feelings, but I also want to share honestly my thoughts on what is going on, particularly on the protection of civilians. So I would argue that this is the most serious crisis that the post-World War II international system on human rights and protecting civilians, and thus women and children, has seen until today. And I will explain why I think so. First, if we take an historical perspective, as Patricia was saying, there has always been a tendency in humanity in treating civilians, which were often defined as women, children, and the elderly before the term civilians is more of this century, are considered legitimate targets. They are part of the enemy, and therefore they should be killed, and this will demoralize the enemy and help us win the war. That's perfectly legitimate, let's say, a military theory that has held for thousands of years. But at the same time, since the ancient times, you have seen also the opposite tendency. There are some fascinating old bronze plates from ancient Persia, where it was said that during war, you should not touch women and children. So these two tendencies have coexisted throughout time. There are some really interesting discussions that Churchill had with de Gaulle and the French in exile in London about the legitimacy of targeting Nazi-occupied France and the issue of civilians. So these are issues that have been discussed forever. And post-World War II, let's say the modern movement to better protect civilians in conflict was born out of the Red Cross in the 1860s, 1870s, but really after the Holocaust and World War II took off with the new system, with the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, etc. And while the two tendencies have continued to exist, at the same time, there has been a lot of normative progress on the protection of civilians. And I would say that progress is jeopardized today by what is happening in Gaza. And first of all, let me say what is happening in Israel and Gaza from the point of view of civilian casualties. I won't spend much time on October 7. Those are actions that are simply criminal. There's nothing to discuss about the killing of civilians, the kidnapping, etc. So I will spend a little bit more time on Israel's operations because that is questionable. Not because that doesn't matter, but because that is very clear. I cannot conclude from what I know, from what I see, that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians. But what I can conclude is that Israel is not taking at all the minimum precautions that it should take to protect civilians. Whether they are targeting them or not, that could be an inquiry of an international or national court. And the reason is, first of all, a sophisticated military knows that a campaign of that intensity in a densely populated area can only cause staggering numbers of civilian casualties. But one could say, well, there is a right of Israel to defend itself, and therefore Hamas is hiding among the populations, and therefore it is good. That's the argument. But if we see the tactics that Israel is using, such as the using of 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated areas, those have not been used by the US military, for example, anywhere in its Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns in populated areas. So there are a number of, there are a number of other disturbing pieces of evidence that can make one conclude that at minimum there is no respect for civilian life, for the minimum rules of international humanitarian law for civilians, women and children. And as we know, half of the population in Gaza is children. If we look at the numbers, the US-led coalition in Iraq and Syria in a decade killed between 8,000 and 13,000 civilians. That is a staggering number. It is an unacceptable number. It is less than the civilians that were killed in 2 to 3 weeks in Gaza. The Russians, in their campaign that nobody here would define less than criminal, killed 10,000 civilians in Ukraine, with evidence of deliberate targeting of civilians in different instances. So the numbers in Gaza are out of the ordinary. It is not normal that so many civilians can be killed in a military campaign. But they're not surprising. And the reason is that evidence gathered by the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, and others shows that when you launch a military operation, particularly an airborne from airplanes military operation in an urban area, 90% of casualties will be civilians. 90. In fact, the numbers, there's this war on numbers, but the numbers make sense. Israel says they've killed 1,000 to 2,000 Hamas fighters. The health authorities in Gaza say that between 15 and 20,000 civilians, or not civilians, people have been killed in Gaza. If you run the math, that is exactly the number. That's the 90% number. To kill, if you want to kill 2,000 Hamas members, you're going to have to accept that 20,000 people will be killed in an urban campaign. So why did I say that, because some people have said, why is this different than, the violence that civilians are suffering today? Darfur, terrible, Ukraine, elsewhere. Why is it, and is it, it's not different because the suffering of one matters more than the other one, but it's different because it's putting a strain into the norms that we as humanity have created after, or have perfected after World War II. And the reason for that is that the proponents of that system have been the United States and European countries. That's the reality. 1946, those are the countries that mostly built the new international order. And the last 50 years, they and a number of civil society groups around the world have worked to get as many countries from the global south as possible to buy into this vision, to buy into this worldview. And then, even before Gaza, the accusation of double standards with Ukraine was already quite strong, coming from government, civil society, and people in the global south. And that's become impossible to counter. When you see the video of Ursula von der Leyen, who is the chief of the European Commission, say that depriving civilians of water, food, and electricity is a war crime, referring to Russia, and being silent when exactly the same thing happened in Israel, it's hard to justify, what this. And this to me is the key point here. Either we believe that these are absolute values, or we have to accept every argument on every side. So for example, some people on one side may say, Israel was attacked, Israel needs security, and that justifies. People on the other side can say, Palestinians deserve a state. They've been occupied for 56 years and 17 years of blockade. Both statements are perfectly true. Where the problem lies is when those statements are used to justify the killing of civilians. Because if you say that, on your side, this justifies the killing of civilians, you have to accept that the other side makes the same argument for their, and then it becomes a cycle of violence, which we are seeing today, that is very hard to stop. So I don't have the solution for this. First and foremost, I think every effort needs to be made to maintain this ceasefire, the current ceasefire. It seems that the US government is leaning towards that after irresponsibly, frankly, in my opinion, fueling war for over a month. And the same is true of European governments. But if we want, there is just no way that a war of that intensity in Gaza can be fought without staggering civilian deaths. And if Israel's purpose is to kill all Hamas fighters, 20,000 fighters, well, if that's 10% of the people that need to be killed to achieve that, then the number of casualties in Gaza will be 200,000. It's unfortunately, we are seeing that these numbers are holding up. So there needs to be a different solution. And of those 200,000, 100,000 will be children. So I'm sorry that I don't have a more positive outlook, but I think there is an urgent need for action. And I think that the place where that action is needed the most is the United States, because the place that has the most influence on Israel today is the United States. And it is absolutely imperative to find a way to satisfy the legitimate security concerns of Israel and the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians to a state without killing tens of thousands of civilians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico, and again, a very difficult act to follow. And thank you very much to the Carter School for the invitation. I think events like this show the social purpose of universities. It's very important that we have space to talk about important issues and sensitive issues, issues that can be dealt with or approached emotionally. And it's important that we have space to talk, to draw on theory, on literature, but also to draw on humanity. In many ways, this is a session that we shouldn't have to be having. We're in 2023. We regard ourselves as a fairly sophisticated species, yet we are literally talking about the fact that grown-ups are killing children on a mass scale in multiple conflicts around the world. This is a conversation that we really shouldn't have to have, but we do have to have it, and I'm glad to be given the space to contribute to it. One of the reasons we shouldn't be having this conversation, and I'm only going to talk about children in this very brief set of remarks, one of the reasons we shouldn't have to have a session like this is because children are protected by a number of international laws. They have unique recognition above and beyond the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which, by the way, Article 26 makes special provision for children. We shouldn't have to be having this conversation because children are protected, as are civilians, under the Geneva Conventions. But on top of that, we have the 1990 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 3 of which notes that every child has an inherent right to life. Now, multiple states and multiple armed actors clearly are in breach of that. The UN Convention is legally binding, has 54 articles, all very obviously about the protection of children. And if that wasn't enough, we have the 2005 UN Security Council Resolution 1612 on children and armed conflict. It's extremely detailed. It really is, although it's almost 20 years old. It is fit for purpose in relation to contemporary conflict. And on top of those legal protections, of course, we have an infrastructure, a legal infrastructure, a peace-building infrastructure that is both international and transnational. Very obviously, we have UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, but we also have lots of INGOs that are child-focused, Save the Children, Plan International, a lot of World Vision's work. So we've got the legal protection, we've got the infrastructure in terms of international organizations and in terms of INGOs, but obviously what's missing is political will. And into this mix are exactly the things that Patricia and Federico have been talking about the social construction of some people being more worthy than others. We've got the dehumanization, we've got the normalization of what Patricia very eloquently called social death. And we have a retreat over the past 2 or 3 decades from the rules-based international order. We have major states, members of the Security Council, who have worked very, very hard to undermine the very organization that they are leading members of. So we're in a position where it has been normalized that children are casualties of war. Within the past 2 weeks, 8 children were killed in Chin State in Myanmar when the Myanmar regime, one of its aircraft, bombed a school. This time last year, UNICEF announced that Yemen had reached the dreadful milestone in which 11,000 children had either been killed or maimed as part of its war since 2015. One of the most notorious incidents occurred on August the 9th, 2018, when a Saudi Arabian jet bombed a school bus, killing 40 children. The bomb was supplied by Lockheed Martin. It weighed 227 kilos. The reason I mention Lockheed Martin, which employs 116,000 Americans and whose CEO brings home over $24 million. The reason I mention this is because of the long lines of imbrication and implication involved in the war on children. This is a war that involves us all. It's not a war that's over there. We have a tendency to exoticize conflict and see it as something that happens in distant lands. But the long lines of implication and imbrication of the global political economy means that actually we are involved in this. The Sudanese civil war, which sadly doesn't attract as much attention as it should, means that 1.7 million children have been displaced over the past 6 months or so, and 9.5 million children lack access to safe drinking water there. And then if we move to the situation of Gaza, quite clearly, it's a very serious situation in which the UN Secretary General described Gaza as being a graveyard for children. Aid workers have come up with a new acronym, which is WCNSF, meaning Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. So we're seeing the slaughter of children on a mass scale, on an industrial scale, in very deliberate ways in which very clever adults holding university degrees, often in engineering or logistics, are working very hard on military campaigns in which children are overwhelmingly the victims. And of course, this is not just about killing children, it's about injuring them, it's about kids who are missing, it's about kids who are malnourished, who are missing their education, who are missing opportunities, and fundamentally missing a childhood. And I think it's important, and we know as conflict scholars, the importance of seeing conflict as a whole of life phenomenon in which, yes, we must move beyond headlines and see the impact of conflict in terms of the body, in terms of time, in terms of place, and in terms of social relations. And in research that I've been carrying out with others, with other fabulous scholars, we've been looking at the microdynamics of encounter between groups in localities in Lebanon, Colombia, and Northern Ireland. And as part of that research, we're conducting life histories. And we're asking people about their childhood, about growing up in situations of conflict or tension. And one of the things that really comes from the research data is the vivid nature of childhood memory in conflict. People remember, as grown-ups, as adults, the exact spot where an incident took place, where a violent incident took place. They remember the exact time of day. They remember the exact color of the clothes they were wearing. They remember the smell of the cordite. The point is that violence, as we know, is vividly imprinted in memory. It's vividly imprinted in what comes next in people's life patterns. One of the things that also comes out from this research is that kids who are growing up in divided societies often don't notice difference. They say, you know, if they're growing up in Beirut or Belfast, that, you know, when they were young children, they played happily with the out-group. They didn't notice difference. They didn't see difference between the in-group and the out-group as being important. In fact, often they were unaware. I have lost count of the number of interview transcripts in which adults reflecting on their childhood say, it didn't matter. It doesn't matter. It didn't matter. We didn't think about it in terms of their attitude towards the out-group. So it's very difficult, I think, to be optimistic when we're seeing a war on children in many places around the planet. But let me finish with a thought experiment, okay? Think about the prerequisites to be a peacemaker. Think about what is required if you need to make peace. And actually, children have many of those prerequisites. You need optimism. Well, kids are usually very optimistic. You know, they're extremely optimistic coming up to birthdays, Christmas, and other celebrations. Children have immense patience. Anyone who reared a child during COVID and various lockdowns will be aware of the patience that children have. All of us have been to school, and that was an exercise in patience, in queuing up or lining up, of being told to wait, of waiting our turn. Children have immense imagination, and we know imagination is needed in peacemaking and peace building. Think of the imaginative play that children engage in. Children also are extraordinarily good at rules, both following rules and making rules. If you've ever in the past few years played a board game with a child, you will know that the rules of these games are extraordinarily complex. Often you need a degree in astrophysics to understand the rules of many of these board games that kids play, and the kids know the rules. Or if they make up games, they make up rules as well, rules that are based on fairness, on taking your turn. Also, think about what's required for peacemaking and peace building. Cooperation, sociality, all of which children have in large measure. And finally, one thing that seems to be required in making peace is the ability to be patronized. You know, all of us that work in this field, we're used to being patronized at university meetings. Oh, you're doing peace, you know, and the head goes to one side. Children are very used to being patronized as well. So when we think about the prerequisites for making peace, maybe we should look to children. Of course, what kids don't have in all of this is power, particularly material power. And if we think about peace and conflict, we can see a massive bias towards material power, towards military power, state power, formal power. What the peace scholar Kenneth Maulden called power over as opposed to power with. And I think, therefore, I would end by urging us to think carefully about power and to think about ways in which we can raise the profile of immaterial forms of power, the sorts of power that help in making peace and the sorts of power that children have in large amounts. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I'm going to, if I can manage it. We'll have some question and answers. Okay. I don't want to mispronounce the name. Abdul?
Yes, thank you, Professor. So my question is about, because yesterday I was watching some of the comments that made by the women that were freed from Israeli prisons, and they were talking about some women who were brought from Gaza the past 4 weeks, and it brought to my attention to ask Federico, what is the legal requirement for either Israel or, let's say, Russia taking civilians from the war zone? So, because according to the Hamas report in Gaza, there are around 5,000 civilians who are either missing or maybe killed, and they are still under wreckage. So what is the legality behind or the legality that mandates governments to disclose who are being kidnapped or maybe taken from the war zone?
Yes, thank you, Abdullah Rahman. I mean, the answer is simple. There is no legality. There is, depending on the situations, in the case of Russia, it has been alleged at the ICC that this is forced deportation, and there is a case at the ICC against President Putin and a woman that runs this program, and so similarly, the same applies everywhere. So there are procedures for arresting people for being suspected of crimes, right? But when you deport people for their own safety, or whatever, or for whatever reason without their consent, that is absolutely illegal. And again, I think, as Roger was saying, there has been such a breach of different rules across theaters of conflict in the past decades, especially the past 2 decades, I would say, that it's hard to keep count and it's how to counter. But there is definitely no legality to doing that. As I have the floor, I see a question from Kagla or Chagla. I'm not sure what's your name is on collateral damage. In the chat, I think everyone can see it, and I cannot agree more with you, Chagla. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. In fact, if you see the campaign, I launched a campaign at Civic Before Leaving to raise awareness on civilian casualties, and it was not collateral damage. Because I've been sitting in way too many meetings at the Pentagon and elsewhere where this term was used, and we go back to that, to dehumanize, what is collateral damage? It could be a glass window. Oh, well, but it could also be 2 civilians that were passing by. So I agree with you. I never use this term, never. I always speak about civilian casualties because language matters. Language is part of what allows for the persistence of these atrocities when we repackage them, in different ways. So, yeah.
Now,
Thank you all. Absolutely so insightful contributions and much appreciated. My question is regarding the way violence breeds violence, and with that, the radicalization of young people in conflict-affected environments. So, considering that so many young people, children, what they've been experiencing in Gaza, and the violence inflicted on them, and all of you touch upon this, the way their lives have been so terribly affected by this humanitarian tragedy. What are your thoughts on the way the current episode of this violence in Israel-Palestine conflict will feed into further violence in Israel-Palestine conflict in the future?
May I respond to that, Al, please? I think it's an excellent question, and I have to say I'm very disheartened that in a sense this is yet another episode in that conflict, albeit a very serious episode, in which there is no serious discussion of political outcomes or settlements. We know from our studies that there are 2 main ways that conflicts end. One is through violence suppression, the other is through negotiation. And I think it would be no secret to say that many of us in this room are in favor of negotiated outcomes. So when we think about the impact of violence on young people and children, I think it's worth thinking about alternatives to feelings of revenge, alternatives to feelings of grief, alternatives to feelings of marginalization. And therefore, we really do need to think of long-term political remedies that would impact on all of Israel and Palestine. It's not just Gaza, it's the entire, the two countries, but also the region. And these alternative, some sort of political outcome could then lead the way to alternatives away from violence. These alternatives include things like education. Education, to me, is the most transformative social intervention that we as a species can make. It is the thing that is the route towards social mobility. It is the alternative for many, it is the alternative towards violence and radicalization. But without some sort of political impetus, without some sort of, I'm not a huge fan of the term solution, but without some sort of political agreement, I find it very difficult to think of the alternatives that many children and youth in Gaza might have towards narratives that encourage them to become radicalized. So that would be my response, Al.
Can I complement that, Padlan, with some studies, because I think your question is very important. There is a very compelling 2017 multi-year, multi-country study by UNDP. It's called The Tipping Point, which basically asked several former members of militant groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria and elsewhere, what was the tipping point that made you join this group? 71% said that they had long-standing grievances, exclusion, poverty, governance, but the tipping point was violence by the state against themselves or their community. 71%. It's guaranteed that. The second piece of evidence is one of my favorite lines when I am sitting with politicians or militaries from countries that are enthusiastic about the military solution. I say, name me one militant group that has disappeared, that doesn't exist anymore from the past 10 to 20 years because of military operations by the US, Europe, or others. There is none. Yes, ISIS has been degraded, but it's still there. It just doesn't work, and it will never work. Like if we look at Mali, the constant military solutions have only worsened the problems. So it's naive to think that violence will solve and that it will not breed more violence, as you say, Al-Padlan.
Thank you both. Thank you.
I have a comment in regards to your question, Al. In the work that I've done in the various places I mentioned, what I have been long puzzled by was the fact that youth and young folks are not included in either the organizations or the governments thinking about what they need or what they want. They're not particularly asked, and the folks that I've spoken to over the years have either made their own a lot of former fighters have created their own organizations that looked at how do you deviolence the mind, and how do they come up with their own cultural practices based on things that had been going on 20 years before. And that seemed to be, as far as I could see there, at least in that one place, it was seen as legitimate. And it was seen as, this is how we we engage with the violence that we have engaged in, and the violence that has been done to us. And so I'm always interested in localized practices in lieu of not having anything set that is constant by the government, and also by the importance of having young folks own how they engage with that, and how they can be much more creative in both ways, in negatively and positively. But the idea of, okay, you've seen this, you've lived it to a certain point, what are your thoughts? And having those things honored. The idea of youth being honored is not really common. Youth are just waiting to be grown-ups, and then they can do what they want, but they have a lot of really good ideas. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. If we don't have any question, I just want to do the follow-up. And then I think all of you touch upon this, the agency of women and children. I think the recognition of that is so important, isn't it? Because often their victimized by number of actors in the international context. And there's a lack of recognition that women, like Patricia, you point out, that their agency in conflict transformation, in peace building, is not really appreciated. And those people, those groups, children, young people, and women, are often excluded from peacemaking, right? And so in the Gaza context, and what roles do you think, I mean, considering what they've been experiencing, what roles do you think that these groups could play? Because Roger, your point around power over, there is not only the power by Israel over Palestinians, but there's the Hamas power over Palestinians and other political actors. And so, living in an open prison for years, and your only, sort of chance of progress socially, politically, in the context that you need to be part of those local structures. What can we do to enable those groups like women, children, and young people in that? Hopefully this tragedy will come to an end, but I'm just really thinking the day after moment, really, in terms of preparing ourselves to assist these people so that they can actually use their agency more effectively.
If I could respond with 2 brief points, Alp. One is, if we think about the Havana process that led to the peace accord in Colombia, basically the last major comprehensive peace accord that we have seen, victims were included in the Havana process and accompanied the process and actually give testimony in Havana. And I think that is something that we can learn from, that victims, and of course, I don't want to say that all women and children are victims, of course not, as you rightly say, they have agency, but to include them in a peace process rather than as an afterthought seems very important. But we've also seen peace processes in which there is some sort of civic forum. There is some sort of consultative forum in which alternative voices can be heard. The difficulty with so many peace processes, and Israel-Palestine does not have a peace process, but the difficulty with so many of them is that they are elite level stitch-ups in which military and political elites make an agreement and then expect everyone else to to abide by it and to live it and to make it. So I think to think about inclusion in negotiations, and there's very good empirical evidence to show that the more participatory and the more inclusive a set of negotiations, then A, the greater chance that it will stick, that agreement will be made, and B, that it will stick. So I think that there are a few things, but you're absolutely right to point out power relations which are based on excluding women and children.
In just a few, do you have a question, Al, or a comment?
No, thank you. Just that there's a question in the chat, Patricia.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Thank you so much for organizing this. To shift my glasses. Provided a lot of insight, and I'm truly grateful. Sorry. Hamas. Learning more about how the U.S. is involved in these international conflicts. All right, Ashley, do you want to speak to this, to say anything, or I know you're asking a question. So Ashley is wondering, learning more about how the U.S. is involved in these international conflicts, even if they are not directly fighting the war. Okay, there's a lot to be said for what the U.S. is involved in.
Can I start by
Yeah.
provide my opinion? So in my opinion, yes, as I've said before, I mean, first of all, the US is the biggest provider of weapons to one of the parties in this conflict and to parties in other conflicts, right? It's one of the biggest allies and providers of weapons to Saudi Arabia and their role in Yemen, in the Yemen war, and we could go on and on. And in my personal opinion, the days after October 7 were the days where the US administration could have tried to pour water and not oil over the fire. And on October 7 or October 8, there was a tweet by President Biden that said, Israel has a right to defend itself, period. And he spelled period. And that to me was devastating, because that period means no caveats, means everything goes. Of course, he regretted it. We can see it these days. But not stating from the beginning, this was criminal. Israel has a right to defend itself and the population in Gaza. And we knew, right? It's not like this is the first time. We knew that thousands of Palestinians would die. So that is, in my mind, has been irresponsible and has fueled the conflict, because it has given political backing to an unrestrained response.
Thank you. We tend to, in the U.S., give weapons whenever there are any. We bring weapons to the site and leave it there. So it's, yeah. Yes, iPhone. So the idea of how would the U.S. engage positively rather than adding weapons to the fire, so to speak, and adding implicit acceptance of the slaughter of women and children, because that's what it was. How do we think about that, U.S. folks? Yes, iPhone.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was trying to find my mute. This is Catherine. Yeah, so this is a very good discussion, but before we go to that, I was just wanted to comment about the agency of women that Dean Ossendam had mentioned, as well as Roger had talked about using illiterate. We know that in Palestine, they have they had a law in place to domesticate UNHCR 1325, which has to do with women, peace, and security. And they've been at work throughout. So I guess one of the questions that came up is how can we empower localized processes? We know before the war, there was already localized processes in Palestine. And we know that the region was also highly securitized, which means that they were operating outside of the monitoring and evaluation measures that that we see across the board in places that have endured conflict for a long period of time. And so we know that they have their own organic frameworks and processes that we can kind of research, tap into, and empower those processes so that we're not just using the elite-driven models that are that we can see from the West, from this vantage point. So that's something I wanted to say. There's a way that we can kind of try and find out what or try and see from literature or the news as things are coming out, what localized processes have been in place, and try and harness those. That was my comment. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia.
Okay. Takers. So I think one of the things, Catherine, is that how would US folks, and maybe US folks shouldn't be going into that zone, how do we understand what's going on locally? What has gone on right now, it's a disaster, but how might that really, starting at the grassroots level and just gathering ideas and gathering information? Any comments?
I think I don't have the answers, but I think one good place for us as a Qatar school to begin with is I know we have this I guess ways to mine data on social media to see what's happening and just kind of just go through that data and see what themes are coming up from the field, because we know that regular Joe, regular Jane in Gaza, northern Gaza, as they're moving out, they are talking online whenever they have a chance. So that's one way of kind of seeing what's going on the ground. Another way is probably to ask, to kind of seek out experts who've been there in the past, who've been conducting work in that region before the war, just to see who and which local CBOs they were working with, just to kind of get a frame of where things were before, because this has, again, as we know, it's a protracted conflict. So we go with the assumption that there are some localized processes that we do not know about, and then compare those with what we are seeing from our vantage point, whether it's from UN Women that had an office in Jerusalem, and on UN Women in Palestine, and the work that has already been done up to the war, and then go from there. But I see this as a very, very worthy project, especially when we come to answering questions from our student body on how they can get involved, or what kind of papers, theses they should be coming up with, writing to fill this gap, because obviously this is a gap. We don't know what's been going on on the ground, but someone does, and there's some material somewhere that we can borrow from.
Thank you. Federico or Roger, any comments? Okay. Any other questions? Comments? Okay, I will say it has been an honor to be part of the panel and to have shared some space and some thinking with my colleagues and all of you who have attended. So thank you for that. And any final comments by anybody?
Patricia, I just want to join you to thank both Federico and Roger for their participation. I think this has been a great conversation, and your inputs really made us to think about this challenge we are facing, but looking at it from different angles, and our Mason community and our guests from outside Mason community, we really appreciate for joining us this morning. It was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everybody.